On December 25, 1991, the red flag of the Soviet Union was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. And to the rest of the world, it looked like a political collapse, like a victory for democracy or a defeat for communism. But if you looked at the ledger books inside the Ministry of Finance, you would have seen a different story altogether. The Soviet Union didn't die because of an ideology. It didn't die because of a revolution. It died because it ran out of money. This is the story of the greatest bankruptcy in human history. It is the story of a superpower that possessed 40,000 nuclear warheads but couldn't afford to buy bread. It is a lesson on what happens when a nation becomes addicted to a single resource. And what happens when the dealer finally cuts you off. But here's the thing that nobody talks about. There was a number, a specific date when the clock started ticking toward zero. And it wasn't 1991, it was 1986, and the number was $10 per barrel. Remember that number because by the time we're done, you'll understand why it killed an empire that had survived Hitler, Stalin, and the atomic bomb. To understand how a superpower goes broke, we have to go back to the moment they thought they were rich. The year was 1965. In the frozen wastelands of western Siberia, Soviet geologists made a discovery that would change the fate of the 20th century. They found oil, specifically the Samotler field, and it wasn't just an oil field, it was a sea of black gold stretching across thousands of square miles. At the time, this seemed like a miracle sent from the heavens. The Soviet economy was already slowing down. The communist system was struggling to produce consumer goods. But suddenly, they didn't need to produce good cars or televisions. They just needed to drill holes in the ground and watch the money flow. Throughout the 1970s, the price of oil skyrocketed. The OPEC embargo against the West sent prices through the roof. And the Soviet Union became the biggest beneficiary of the crisis. Billions of dollars in hard currency flooded into Moscow. Up to $20 billion a year by 1980, which was 50 to 70% of all Soviet hard currency earnings. It was the greatest lottery win in the history of the Russian state, and the leadership thought they had finally beaten the West at their own game. But this wealth was a curse disguised as a blessing because it masked the rot underneath. Because the oil money was so easy, the Soviet leadership stopped trying to fix their broken economy. Why reform the factories when you can just sell oil? Why fix the agriculture when you can just sell oil? Why invest in technology when the ground beneath your feet is printing money? The Soviet Union became a petro-state, essentially a third-world economy with first-world rockets. They stopped making things the world wanted to buy and started exporting raw materials while importing everything else. They were trading the blood of the earth for food, for machines, for consumer goods, and for silence. The leadership in the Kremlin used the oil windfall to buy loyalty across the board. They subsidized food prices, keeping bread artificially cheap so the people wouldn't riot. They subsidized housing. They subsidized their satellite states in Eastern Europe, keeping the entire Warsaw packed afloat on Russian oil money. They built a massive military machine that consumed 15 to 20% of GDP, possibly even 25%, though the real numbers were hidden even from themselves. It was a golden age on the surface, but it was built on a foundation of sand. The entire stability of the Soviet Union was pegged to one number, the price of a barrel of oil on the international commodities market. As long as oil was over $30 a barrel, the Soviets were rich, they were invincible, they could invade Afghanistan, they could threaten Europe, they could race the Americans to space. But in the early 1980s, the math began to change in ways the Kremlin couldn't control. The United States and Saudi Arabia were watching closely, and they realized that the Soviet bear was actually a junkie, and its drug was high oil prices. In the commodities markets, a storm was gathering that would become a hurricane. The demand for oil was dropping as the West became more energy efficient after the shocks of the 70s. At the same time, new oil supply was coming online from the North Sea and from Alaska, flooding the market with crude. The price was wobbling, and the Soviet budget planners were starting to sweat. And then their agriculture sector collapsed completely, and this is the part of the story that is often forgotten. The Soviet Union, which possessed some of the most fertile farmland on Earth in Ukraine, the legendary black soil, could not feed itself. The collective farm system was so catastrophically inefficient that half the potatoes would rot in the fields before they reached the store. And the grain harvest was a national humiliation year after year. So the superpower had to buy grain, millions of tons of it, 30 to 40 million tons annually by the early 80s. And who were they buying it from? They were buying it from their archenemy, the United States of America. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was spending nearly half of its hard currency earnings, $10 to $15 billion a year, just to import grain. They were selling oil to the West to buy wheat from the West. It was a humiliating cycle of dependency. And it meant that every drop in the oil price was a direct threat to whether Soviet citizens would eat. But the Kremlin wasn't worried, not yet. They looked at their oil charts and saw the money pouring in. They thought the party would last forever. They thought the price of oil could only go up. They didn't realize that they were walking on the edge of a cliff, and the ground was about to give way beneath their feet. Now I know what you're thinking. Couldn't they just adapt? Couldn't they diversify the economy or cut spending or reform the system? That's what any rational government would do, but that was just the warm-up. The real danger is what happens when a petro-state realizes it's trapped, when the money is flowing out faster than it's coming in. And when the people you borrowed from start asking questions you can't answer. The timeline for the apocalypse was set, and the Soviet Union was about to face the perfect economic storm. The year is 1985, and Mikhail Gorbachev enters the Kremlin as General Secretary. He's young, he's energetic, he's a reformer, and he knows the system is stagnant and corrupt. But even he doesn't realize how close to the edge they are. He thinks the Soviet Union has a cold, maybe pneumonia. In reality, it has terminal cancer, and the organs are already shutting down. Gorbachev announced a grand plan, perestroika, restructuring of the entire economy. He wanted to modernize Soviet industry, invest in machine building, make Soviet products competitive again on the world stage. To pay for this massive investment, he needed cash, lots of it. He looked at the budget and assumed the oil revenue would be there to fund his reforms, that the $20 billion a year would keep flowing forever. He was catastrophically wrong. On September 13, 1985, the Saudi oil minister, Ahmed Zaki Yamani, declared that Saudi Arabia was tired of holding back production to keep prices high while other producers cheated. They were going to open the taps and flood the market with cheap oil. The result was a massacre in the commodities markets. In 1985, oil was at $35 a barrel. By late 1986, it crashed to $10 a barrel, a 70% collapse in less than a year. For the Soviet Union, this was a death sentence written in crude oil. In the blink of an eye, the empire lost half of its income, $15 to $20 billion a year, simply vanished from the budget. Imagine if you suddenly lost half your salary overnight, but your mortgage, your car payments, your grocery bills, and your credit card debt all stayed exactly the same. That's what happened to the Soviet government. The Soviet budget was calculated based on expensive oil. Every ministry, every subsidy, every weapons program was funded, assuming oil would stay at $30 a barrel. Suddenly, there was a massive hole in the ledger. Tens of billions of dollars evaporated into thin air. And this happened at the worst possible moment in Soviet history. The Soviet Union was bogged down in a costly war in Afghanistan, bleeding billions of dollars and thousands of lives. They were sending millions of dollars a day to prop up communist regimes in Cuba, Vietnam, Angola, and a dozen other basket case economies around the world. They were trying to maintain nuclear parity with America as launched the Star Wars program, which meant even more defense spending. And they still had to buy the grain shipments. The grain ships were arriving in Odessa every week, demanding payment in hard currency, in dollars or gold, not rubles. The Soviets couldn't pay in rubles because the ruble was a soft currency. It was worthless outside the Soviet Union. You couldn't use rubles to buy American wheat or German machines. You needed real money. So Gorbachev faced an impossible choice. He could cut military spending, which would anger the generals and threaten his position. He could cut food subsidies, which would anger the people and risk riots in the streets. Or he could borrow money from the West and hope the oil price would recover. He chose to borrow, and that decision sealed the Soviet Union's fate. The Soviet Union began to take out massive loans from Western banks, from German banks, French banks, British banks. And they were happy to lend because, after all, this was a superpower. A superpower doesn't go bankrupt, right? The Soviets had a perfect credit rating. They had massive gold reserves rumored to be thousands of tons. They seemed like the safest bet in the world. So the loans flowed in, billions and billions of dollars. But this wasn't investment capital. This wasn't money being used to build factories that would generate profit and growth later. This was survival money, pure and simple. The Soviets were borrowing billions just to buy food and consumer goods. To keep the shelves from looking completely empty, to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. It was a credit card spiral. They were borrowing to eat, and the debt was compounding. To make matters even worse, Gorbachev made a domestic economic mistake that accelerated the collapse. In 1985, he launched an aggressive anti-alcohol campaign. He saw that vodka was destroying the health of the Soviet worker. That alcoholism was a national epidemic, so he restricted sales, raised prices, and even destroyed vineyards. Morally, it was probably the right thing to do. Economically, it was suicide. The tax on vodka was one of the largest sources of revenue for the state, second only to oil, bringing in 12 to 14 billion rubles a year, which was about 10 to 12% of the entire state budget. By restricting vodka sales, Gorbachev wiped out another huge chunk of government revenue, billions of rubles just gone. And here's the kicker: the people didn't stop drinking, they just started brewing moonshine at home, samagan. So the state got zero revenue from alcohol, and the people started hoarding sugar to make the illegal booze. The sugar disappeared from the stores because people were buying it all to ferment at home. By 1988, the deficit was spiraling completely out of control. The Soviet government was spending 34% more than it was earning, which is an insane number. So they started doing the one thing you should never do when you're in a fiscal crisis. They turned on the printing presses. They printed rubles to pay the workers' wages, to keep the factories running, to maintain the illusion of normalcy. But because there were no goods in the shops to buy, the money just piled up in people's bank accounts and dresser drawers. This is called a monetary overhang. The people had pockets full of cash, but the stores were empty, so the cash was worthless. The shortage economy kicked into high gear. People would stand in line for 4 hours for a loaf of bread. And if they saw a line forming, they would join it without even asking what was being sold. It might be shoes, it might be sausages, it might be toilet paper. You grabbed whatever you could because tomorrow it would be gone. The social contract was breaking down in real time. The Soviet people had tolerated the lack of freedom, the lack of choice, the censorship. Because the state provided stability, they had cheap rent, guaranteed jobs, guaranteed food. Now the stability was gone, the shelves were bare, the money was worthless, and the future looked terrifying. And the West was watching this slow-motion train wreck with growing alarm. The banks in London and Frankfurt started to get nervous. They noticed that the Soviet Union was borrowing just to pay the interest on previous loans, which is the classic sign of insolvency. The debt had exploded from almost zero in the early 80s to $50 billion by the late 80s. And climbing fast, the bankers realized that the emperor had no clothes, and more importantly, he had no cash. By 1989, the Soviet economy wasn't just stalling, it was disintegrating before the world's eyes. The Berlin Wall fell in November, and the satellite states in Eastern Europe broke free one by one. To the world, this looked like a political liberation, the triumph of freedom over tyranny. But to the accountants in Moscow, it was a financial catastrophe of the highest order. For decades, the Soviet Union had forced Eastern Europe to trade in a closed loop, buying Soviet oil and gas at inflated prices, and selling goods back at artificially low prices. Now those countries demanded to be paid in real dollars for their goods. And the entire trading bloc collapsed overnight. Inside the Kremlin, panic was setting in. The gold reserves were vanishing at an alarming rate. In the mid-80s, the Soviets had hundreds of tons of gold bars. Sitting in the vault, a legacy of decades of savings. By 1990, they were secretly flying gold to London and Zurich, selling it in a panic just to pay for the next shipment of wheat or to make an overdue loan payment. They sold so much gold so quickly that they actually depressed the global gold price, getting even less value for their desperation sales. Then the War of Laws began, and this was the final internal blow to Soviet finances. The Soviet republics, Russia, Ukraine, the Baltics, started to withhold tax revenue from the central government in Moscow. Boris Yeltsin, the leader of the Russian Republic, told his tax collectors directly, "Keep the money here, don't send it to Gorbachev." The central Soviet budget evaporated almost overnight. Gorbachev was the president of a superpower with 40,000 nuclear warheads. But he had no income. He commanded the nuclear missiles, but he couldn't pay the guards who watched them. In 1990, the unthinkable happened, something that would have been unimaginable just 5 years earlier. The Soviet Union started defaulting on its commercial payments. Ships full of frozen meat and butter anchored off the coast of Leningrad refused to dock because the captains radioed that they wouldn't unload the cargo until the check cleared. But the checks were bouncing. The Soviet government, the mighty Soviet government, had to beg for extensions. They went to the West, hat in hand, and asked for humanitarian aid. It was a humiliation that burned like acid. The nation that had defeated Hitler, the nation that had put the first man in space, the nation that had terrified the West for 40 years, was now asking Germany for care packages of powdered milk and canned beef. Vneshekonombank, the Soviet Bank for Foreign Economic Affairs, froze all accounts. Soviet companies that had earned hard currency through trade woke up one morning to find their accounts empty. The state had confiscated their money to pay the national debt. It was theft on a national scale, and trust was completely destroyed. The ruble ceased to function as money in any meaningful sense. The economy switched to barter. Factories paid their workers in tires or crystal glasses or light bulbs or whatever they produced. Workers would then stand on the side of the road, trying to trade a set of tires for a bag of potatoes or a bottle of vodka. The black market became the only real market. The dollar became the only real currency that mattered. Taxi drivers, prostitutes, and waiters were the new elite because they had access to foreign cash tips. Meanwhile, professors and scientists were paupers, their life savings worthless. In August 1991, hardline communists launched a desperate coup against Gorbachev. They parked tanks in Red Square. They arrested reformers. They wanted to restore order and turn back the clock to the good old days. But they forgot one critical thing: you can't shoot economics. The coup leaders didn't have a plan to fix the debt. They didn't have a plan to put food on the shelves. They didn't have a plan to pay the foreign creditors. The coup collapsed in 3 days, not just because the people resisted, but because the plotters realized they were fighting for the captain's chair. On the Titanic, and the ship was already underwater, when Gorbachev returned to power after the coup failed, he was a ghost. A man without authority. The real power had shifted to Boris Yeltsin and the individual republics, but the debt remained. Hovering over everything like a death sentence, the Western banks and the G7 nations called an emergency meeting because they were terrified. The Soviet Union owed nearly $70 billion in foreign debt. If the country broke apart into 15 separate republics, who would pay the debt? Would Ukraine pay? Would Kazakhstan pay? Would anyone pay? They demanded a joint and several responsibility agreement. They told the republics bluntly, "We don't care who's in charge, but someone has to sign for this debt, or the entire global financial system could be at risk." In the final months of 1991, the Soviet Union existed only on paper. There was no money for the November payroll. There was no money for the December payroll. The printing presses ran 24 hours a day, printing large denomination banknotes that were worth less than the paper they were printed on. Hyperinflation had arrived. Prices were rising by 300%, and everyone knew the end was near. December 1991, the end of the line. The central bank of the Soviet Union, Gosbank, was completely insolvent. They had literally run out of gold. The legendary reserves, rumored to be thousands of tons, the treasure that was supposed to back the mighty ruble, were gone. Investigating prosecutors later found only about 240 tons left in the vaults. The rest had been sold, stolen, smuggled, or wasted in the desperate attempt to keep the system afloat for just one more month. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev sat at his desk in the Kremlin to sign his resignation as president of the Soviet Union. He didn't resign because he was conquered by an invading army. He didn't resign because of a revolution in the streets. He resigned because he had lost the ability to write checks. The Soviet Union officially ceased to exist at midnight, but the ghost of the empire lingered in the ledger books and the debt collection notices. The new Russian Federation, led by Boris Yeltsin, inherited the seat at the United Nations. It inherited the nuclear codes and the missiles, and it inherited the debt. Russia agreed to take on 100% of the Soviet Union's foreign debt, all $70 billion of it. In exchange for claiming all the Soviet Union's foreign assets, the embassies, the property, and the remaining scraps of gold. It was called the zero-option deal. This debt burden crushed the new Russia for years. Throughout the 1990s, the new democratic government was strangled by the interest payments on loans taken out by the communists decades before. The shock therapy economic reforms that followed, the privatization, the price liberalization, were a direct result of this bankruptcy. There was no money to cushion the transition, no safety net. Subsidies were slashed overnight, prices for food skyrocketed by 2,000%, and the life savings of millions of ordinary Russians were wiped out in a matter of days. The poverty that followed was horrific, truly horrific. But here's what you need to understand. It wasn't caused by the collapse of 1991. It was caused by the addiction of the 1970s. The pain of the 1990s was the withdrawal symptom from the oil high. It took years for Russia to climb out of the hole. In 1998, Russia defaulted again on its debts, crashing global markets and wiping out hedge funds in New York. It wasn't until the oil prices started to rise again in the 2000s. When crude climbed back above $50, then $80, then $100 a barrel, that the debts were finally cleared and Russia could breathe again. In 2017, Russia paid off the last remaining debt of the Soviet Union, a small payment to Bosnia and Herzegovina. It took 26 years to close the account of a dead empire. Now here's the golden thread I promised you at the beginning. Remember that number, $10 per barrel in 1986. That single number, that one price on a trading screen in London, triggered a cascade that killed a superpower. It took 5 years from the oil crash in 1986 to the final collapse in 1991. 5 years from rich to bankrupt. The fall of the Soviet Union is the ultimate cautionary tale of the resource curse. And it teaches us lessons that are more relevant today than ever. It teaches us that natural resources are not the same as economic strength. That commodity wealth and real economic power are two completely different things. The Soviets thought they were rich because they had oil. They confused luck with genius. They mistook a lottery win for economic development. They used the easy money to mask their structural problems, to buy social peace, and to hide their inefficiencies. They built a superpower on a foundation of commodities, on the price of a single resource that they didn't control. They pegged their survival to a number on a trading screen in London and New York. And when that number dropped, the 40,000 nuclear warheads couldn't save them. The KGB couldn't save them. The Communist Party couldn't save them. The ideology couldn't save them. Because an empire that cannot pay for its bread is not an empire. It is a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. In the end, the Cold War wasn't won by a missile or a speech or a spy. It was won by a grain shipment that the Soviets couldn't afford to buy and an oil price that they couldn't control. The hammer and sickle didn't fall in a revolution. It went bankrupt. It ran out of money. And that, more than anything else, is what killed the Soviet Union.